If you're a beginning quilter, I bet you've been in the store and you've seen all sorts of presser feet that seem to be needed to make a quilt. Do you really need all those presser feet? No, you don't need all of them, but there is one that you do need. There are three major sewing steps in making a quilt. They are piecing, quilting, and binding. Piecing is when you take all those little pieces of fabric and sew them together to make the pretty design on the front of the quilt. The seams that are used in quilting are just like any other seam that you would make on your sewing machine, so really you can just use your regular general purpose foot that came with the machine. The tricky part about quilting is that these seam allowances have to be exactly a 1/4 inch. And that is because all those pieces that you've cut accurately, I talk about that in another video, have to be able to be sewn together all at a 1/4 inch so that when you're done, they all fit together and match nicely. So it's really important to get the nice 1/4 inch seam. So how do you get that nice even 1/4 inch seam? This is a piece of fabric that I've marked that has a line a 1/4 inch away from the edge. So that would be a line that would show you a 1/4 inch seam. But we're not going to spend all our time marking our fabric. The first method I'm going to show you uses just your plain regular foot. This is my regular general purpose foot that came out with my machine. I'm going to take a ruler here and put it underneath the foot. And I'm going to line it up so that it's nice and straight this way. And the needle comes down. When I put the presser foot down, I look at the needle and see that it comes down right on the 1/4 inch line here. So right now we know that this needle is a 1/4 inch away from this edge here. So this is the nice low-tech way to do this. I'm just going to take a piece of washi tape. You can also use masking tape, but you wouldn't want to use anything that was too sticky because you don't want sticky stuff left on your machine when you take this off. And you just line this tape right up along the edge of the ruler there. And that's like a marking for you to line your fabric edge up with. One thing I want to point out though is you don't want to have any tape over the feed dogs here. These move. I don't think the light's quite good enough that you can see it, but they move and you don't want tape to be down into your machine because it got caught on those. So now when I take my ruler away and I put my fabric under here and I line up the edge of the fabric right against where this tape is, and if you want you can even put several layers of tape down to make a little ridge, then this needle will be right on that 1/4 inch seam. There are also little guides like this. This is a magnetic guide that you can put here that will do the same thing if you don't want to use the tape, but this does sometimes slide a little bit and tape is really easy. If you're a really beginner sewer, lining this edge up along here is probably feeling like a little tricky, so you can, if you want to, get something called a 1/4 inch piecing foot. And this is a fancy one that has this little guide in the front here. So when I put this on my machine here, this little guide here helps that fabric get pushed right into the exact right spot for making a 1/4 inch seam. The last kind of foot is the one that I use all the time, but I have been sewing for a very long time. That is just a plain old 1/4 inch foot. The distance here from the needle to the edge on both sides is a 1/4 inch. So when I put it in here, when I sew my quilts, I just line the edge of the fabric up with the edge of the foot. For a beginner sewer, this might be a little difficult to still make straight seams, and you might really be better off with the low tech using your regular old foot that came with your machine and putting this piece of tape here, because when you're first sewing and learning how to sew, you really want to make sure you look back here so that you get nice straight seams. So as you can tell, a special piecing foot is actually optional because you can use just the piece of tape on your machine to start with your quilting. The second sewing stage of making a quilt is the actual quilting part. The quilting stitches are those that hold the layers of the quilt together. A quilt is actually made of 3 layers of fabric. There's a backing, and then the batting inside that keeps everybody nice and warm and snuggly, and then the top that you just finished making with your piecing stitching. The quilting is the stitching that goes through all those layers, and you can't really see it that much on this quilt except on the back here. This is the quilting stitches. These stitches I did from the front that followed this around, and that holds the quilt together. See, it holds it together like that. That's necessary because the batting will fall apart inside if there isn't some quilting stitches holding everything together. It would get all lumpy and yucky. Because you're sewing many layers together and it's thick like this, you need to use something to do this stitching called a walking foot. A walking foot looks like this. Most of the manufacturers have their own walking feet that fit their machine. You need to use a walking foot so that you don't get ripples and tucks as you're sewing all these many layers together. I'll have another video soon that talks about what the walking foot actually does and why it's necessary when you're doing all these layers like this. But I will tell you, you would not want to do these quilting stitches on your quilt without a walking foot. A walking foot is very necessary. With the walking foot, you can do straight lines or gentle curves. Using a walking foot does not mean that you have to do stitch in the ditch. These quilts all were done using a walking foot. This one has designs like this on it. See the back? This one has diamonds on it, also done with a walking foot. This one has curves. Can't quite see them, but there they are, curves. And then, of course, you can just do straight lines. And you can do different designs. See, I have very narrow here, and it gets bigger, and then narrow up there. You can see it better on the back. If you've seen some fancier quilting, you've probably seen all sorts of squiggles and curves and pebbles and feathers, things like that. This sort of quilting you can't quite do with the walking foot. And to tell you the truth, a lot of those quilts that you've seen were done on long arm machines. But you can do that sort of quilting on your regular machine. It just takes a little more practice and one more special foot. This kind of quilting is called free motion quilting because you actually freely move the fabric underneath the needle. To do that, you need to do a couple things. The first thing you need to do is to lower or cover the feed dogs. So now if I were to sew, these feed dogs don't come up, and so I'd be able to move my quilt freely over them without them catching or pulling. The second thing you need to do is to use a special hopping or free motion foot. This foot doesn't come all the way down. There's actually a little gap here so you can move your quilt, but there's enough pressure down that the needle will be able to pull up without pulling the fabric up as well. It also bounces up and down a little bit. So that's called a free motion or hopping foot. If you want to do free motion quilting, you'll need one of these feet. The very last step is to put the binding around the edge of the quilt. And if you've heard the term hand-finished binding, you might think you don't need a sewing machine at all for this, but in fact you do. Because the very first step of hand-finished binding is always to sew the binding to the front of the quilt. And then the hand-finished part is when you turn it over like this and stitch the back on like that to create the nice binding. So just like when we were doing the quilting, there are lots of layers here. When we see all those layers, we're going to be sewing through all those layers, and we don't want to have any rippling or tucking or pinching, so we need to use the walking foot. So you'd also use the walking foot for when you're sewing your binding on the front of the quilt at least, and then if you machine finish, you would also use it when you're sewing it on the back. So what presser feet do you need to make a quilt? Definitely a walking foot. That's so that you can do the quilting and the binding. Both those things need the walking foot so that you don't get tucks in your top of your quilt. In addition, if you want to, you can get a piecing foot, or you can just use the masking tape like I showed you. And finally, if you do want to start learning how to do free motion quilting, you would want to get one of those hopping or free motion feet. I hope that helps.